Alright guys, my name is Goblin, and today we're going to be discussing whether you should play a meme spec in the Burning Crusade. So what do I mean by a meme spec? Well, a meme spec is a term the community has come up with to describe very niche specs from classic WoW that don't perform powerfully in a competitive raiding environment compared to other classes. But you'll be happy to know that many of these meme specs become more viable when the Burning Crusade is released. So I thought I'd make this video to discuss just how viable they actually are, since to be honest many of them only become a strong spec in the later raid tiers. And also to explain what your life is going to be like as one of these meme specs, where you have to spend extreme amounts of gold to get certain weapons to make it competitive with other DPS. Will you find it to get a raiding guild and, stuff like that. Just before jumping guys, please consider subscribing to the channel if you want to keep up to date with more content like this. Apparently only 15% of the people who actually watch my videos are actually subscribed to the channel, so do consider subscribing because that really does help out. First of all, I'm going to talk about the Ret Paladin, since it's one of the most talked about specs. The first big question people ask is, aren't Blood Elf Paladins better than Alliance Paladins? The answer is yes. A Belf Paladin will do about 200 more DPS than an Alliance Paladin, but only in very later raid tiers when you're absolutely decked out in gear. In early raid tiers, the DPS is fairly similar, although Blood Elf Paladin are slightly better because with Seal of Blood they will get mana regenerated through the Spiritual Achievement passive ability, since Seal of Blood causes a moderate amount of damage to the Paladin. Plus the Blood Elf Rail Shields do give you some extra mana too, and they're really good. But at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter that much. Every raid group would benefit from having a Ret Paladin in the group to refresh Judgment of Wisdom and Light, which provides loads of mana for the raid and a little bit of cheeky AoE healing. So people aren't going to ignore a Ret Paladin for their raid guild just because that guild is on Alliance. It's just not going to happen. Every raid guild will probably bring at least one Ret Paladin. Having more than one is obviously a little bit less useful. Many raids probably won't do that, unless your guild can't get enough, paladin buffs from their Holy and Protection paladins. You probably will find it pretty difficult to get a raid group, to be honest, simply by the fact that there is probably only going to be one spot. But then again, it really depends on what it's going to be like, because I think a lot of people do want to play Ret Paladin when it launches, so a lot of people are going to be playing the class, but the guilds will probably only take one or two Ret Paladins, so that is just something to consider. And when it comes to getting into a dungeon group, any melee class really struggles to get into a dungeon group in the early raid tiers, because melee DPS don't do as much DPS as ranged DPS in tier 4 raiding. But are they any good though? And yeah, they are actually one of the highest DPSs in the early raid tiers. Well, when it comes to melee DPS, they are probably one of the highest. They easily do as much damage as a rogue or warrior, although you will have to go through the effort of crafting the blacksmithing axe Deep Thunder, which is a stupidly powerful weapon for a Ret Paladin because it's a 3.8 second weapon speed, which means the highest possible damage number is very high, and Seal of Command and Seal of Blood are based on weapon damage. However, in the later raid tiers, the warrior and the rogue will take over DPS on you, but in the early raid tiers, and honestly, if you really nail down your gameplay, you can very easily give warriors and rogues a run for their money. You will also need to stack a lot of mana potions and dark runes if you can, since the spec is very mana hungry, and if you run out of mana your DPS drops by a large margin. Another great thing about playing a Ret Paladin is that you get absolute priority over all the fat two-handed weapons that drop in raids, since no other DPS can actually make use of them except an arms warrior, but most warriors play Fury and just roll on two-handed weapons for PvP, so you get all the two-handed weapons, and that's pretty Bob's your uncle. When it comes to PvP, they're not a top tier class like a rogue or a warrior, but will still be pretty powerful. Next we have a Protection Paladin. Protection Paladin becomes way more viable in TBC. They have much less mana issues due to Spiritual Attunement, which means they generate mana whenever they are healed. They have more AoE abilities to hold aggro, like Avenger's Shield. They have a Cleave Taunt ability called Righteous Defense on a very short cooldown. So overall they're a very viable tank for dungeons and raiding, and their value increases over time during the expansion. They're also very extremely desired for dungeons because of their AoE threat, which is by far the best in the game. This allows for DPS to actually have fun during you know, doing dungeons and stuff like that, because they can actually do their AoE DPS and get the dungeons done much faster. Honestly, I've played mage quite a bit in TBC, and being grouped up with a warrior tank or a druid tank is actually painful because I can't do basically anything, and I can only do like single target damage. Next, let's cover the shaman specs. First of all, the enhancement spec. So enhancement gets a significant boost in DPS in the TBC, particularly if you go through all the effort of crafting the blacksmithing weapons at Dragon Maw and double up on them. They have a proc chance to increase your haste by 212 for 10 seconds, so they have really good synergy with Wind Fury spec. Sorry, Wind Fury weapon. On the topic of Wind Fury weapon, the totem provides the most useful DPS boost to other melee DPS in your group. On top of this, you will have Bloodlust and the talent Unleash Rage, which increases the attack power of your party members. Overall, the Enhancement Shaman is a very valuable addition to any melee group. However, in the early raid tiers, melee DPS are nowhere near as good as range DPS, so most raids will probably only run with one solid melee group, which means most raids will probably only want to bring one Enhancement Shaman. But in the later tiers, they may want to bring another, so bear that in mind when it comes to getting a raid spot. In PvP, they're also on a similar playing field to a Ret Paladin, not a top tier class, but still pretty good. Moving on to the Elemental Shaman. Elemental has a little bit of a better time than Enhancement Shaman when it comes to overall DPS and getting a raid spot. Since most raids will stack range DPS, it's good to put an Ele Shaman in the group for Bloodlust and the Totem of Wrath 2, which provides an extra 3% hit and crit for everyone in the party. Since the Elemental spec provides better buffs to a caster DPS, you probably see, you know, at least like 1 to 3 Elemental Shamans in a 25-man raid group. Overall, Shamans are always stacked quite high in a raid group because of Bloodlust, which can be used multiple times in a fight. Now let's talk about Shadow Priest, easily the most powerful support class in the Burning Crusade, and overall probably the most useful class to bring to any raid, in all honesty, but that's only my humble opinion. They are always in high demand because of the amount of support they provide, and because not many people actually play them, so you won't have difficulty getting a raid spot, or, you know, just plugging a dungeon spot. Their DPS is pretty good. It's not top tier, but if you put the effort in and get the Frozen Shadow Weave tailoring set, then you will easily out DPS the melee classes and probably every other DPS on this list, to be honest, although in later raid tiers that probably won't be the case. But DPS isn't the most important thing about a Shadow Priest. The off-healing, mana regeneration and the debuffs they provide are absolutely invaluable. To put it in perspective, with Vampiric Touch, a priest can very easily return a warlock's entire mana pool throughout the course of a raid fight. So if you're in a group of a Shadow Priest, you essentially have 2 mana pools. So you can probably imagine why that is such a significant damage increase for the raid. In PvP, again, not a top tier class, but still pretty strong. Next we have the Druid specs, beginning with the Feral Druid. Overall, very strong DPS and provide a good amount of support with their Leader of the Pack buff that gives party members 5% crit, and an improved Leader of the Pack that provides healing to the party members whenever they crit. So that's pretty cool. What most Feral Druids do is play a little bit of both when it comes to cat and bear form. You will be needed as an extra tank on certain bosses, and it's also useful if you can tank a dungeon, since it will be easy for you to get gear and find a group in the first place. Tanking as a Feral Druid is also very valuable. Very viable. You won't find it difficult to get a raid spot as a Feral Druid, in my opinion, especially if you can, you know, have the flexibility to be versatile. And as a cat in PvP, you're pretty strong, but honestly not good as a rogue. But obviously, Feral Druids are like the ultimate best flag carrier, so for BG pre-mades, you're in very high demand on that front. Next we have the Moonkin. They become a much more viable DPS, and they also provide very useful debuffs and buffs, such as a 5% crit buff, 2 spells, an Insect Swarm that reduces the chance for the boss to hit the actual tank, which will leave some pressure off the tanks. But the demand for a Boom King when it comes to raiding is probably the least on this list, to be honest. Since Elemental Shaman provides near enough the same buff as a Moonkin, they also provide totem buffs and Bloodlust, so something to bear in mind. Technically the crit buff is 2% more for the Boomkin, but overall an Elemental Shaman does provide more support value to a raid. In PvP they aren't very common at all. I think it's mainly because they have to hard cast to deal any decent DPS. Lastly, I'll cover some pretty extreme meme specs very quickly. First of all, the Smite Priest actually do decent DPS as much as a Shadow Priest in early raid tiers, although they obviously don't provide as much support. Arms Warrior will do as much DPS as a Fury Warrior in the early raid tiers if you get a fat two-handed weapon, but Fury will take over in tier 5, and they're also pretty useful for the debuff that they provide, which increases raid melee damage by 4%. Arcane Mage, actually quite viable if you get a tier 5 set bonus, and it is actually the highest DPS spec when you have that bonus. Two-handed Enhancement Shaman, just more of a niche kind of battleground fun spec to mess around with. If you get lucky or procs, it's actually pretty good. Warlock Tank, used frequently for certain raid bosses. Shockadin is shocking, really bad DPS. Spell Power Rogue. Spell Power Rogue was actually a result of a private server bug, so it won't be on live servers in the Burning Crusade, it only works in Classic. And lastly, we have a Survival Hunter. It's not necessarily a melee hunter, but you may bring a Survival Hunter because of the raid debuff that it provides, which increases the attack power of all attackers, and that's actually pretty useful. Anyway guys, that is the end of the video. My name is Medigoblin. Until my next video, ciao.